I would like to welcome everyone on the third talk of Georgian Center for Strategy and Development, which is called NATO and Hybrid Threats. I am Gogita Ღვεδαშვილი, Deputy Director at GCSD, and it's my pleasure and privilege to moderate this extremely interesting discussion with excellent speakers. So this talk is conducted under the project Talk, Research and Discover NATO. So the project aims to introduce NATO-related actual topics and foster evidence-based discussion on NATO's policy. So the project is also included preparation of the research and analytical papers on NATO and concluding conference, which will be held in December 2021. I would like to say a very special thanks to the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Tbilisi to make this event happen, and the project is implemented with the financial support of the Polish Embassy here in Georgia. Also, I'm very happy and proud to introduce our distinguished and really outstanding experts in the field for today's event, Mr. Rasmus Hinduin. He is the head of international relations at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. Previously, he was the deputy head of the Unit for Defense and Cooperation at the Ministry of Defense of Finland. He has served as the defense counselor at the Embassy of Finland in Washington, D.C., and as defense advisor at the permanent representative of the Finland to the EU. He has held several positions in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dealing with the security policy, defense cooperation, and planning. Mr. Hindrén has a master's degree in international relations. He is the author of a number of articles on security and defense policy. Additionally, I just would like to mention that the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, located in Helsinki, Finland, and serves as a hub of expertise to build the resilience and to counter the hybrid threats. The center is an initiative of the government of Finland and supported by the 27 other nations, as well as NATO and the EU. And of course, I should have to introduce our second speaker, Ms. Thináthin Hidasheli. I guess everyone knows her in Georgia, not only. She heads the Georgian think tank, Civic Idea, fighting Soviet legacy in Georgia, confronting Russian propaganda, and advocating for sound defense and security policy for Georgia. Ms. Khidasheli at different times served as a first Deputy Female Minister of Defense of Georgia. She chaired the Parliamentary Committee for European Integration, as well as Inquiry Commission into violations of the freedom of speech and telecommunication laws at the Parliament of Georgia. Before that, she was an elected member of the Tbilisi City Council and founder and chair of the largest human rights advocacy group in entire post-Soviet space, Georgia Young Lawyers Association. Tináthin was a member of the National Anti-Corruption Council for 4 years, and she holds masters in political science from the Central European University in Hungary. So Ms. Khidasheli was presented Freedom Fighter Award by the President Bush and the CEU Impact Award for the outstanding professional achievement. I once again have to express my excitement for having such a great professionals and announce that you all can leave your questions on live video or share them in our inbox. And at the end of our discussion, I will ask our guests to answer on your questions. So as for the hybrid threats, Georgia currently is in the process of finalizing the new national security concept of Georgia. And also, as I know, during the next year, the government is planning to develop the strategy on countering the hybrid threats. So I believe this is a very timely discussion and very much hope to take a lot of food for thoughts on the topic. So before we start the discussion, I just would like to share one very interesting statistical data. GCSD has conducted a quantitative research all over the Georgia 1 year ago, and one of the questions we have asked was following: have you heard of hybrid threats? And only 1/5, 21% of inquired respondents reported on having heard of the hybrid threats. However, after this question, they were asked to name most important hybrid threats in open question format, and the biggest number of respondents, 25% mentioned gen-modified products. So they think that hybrid threats is gen-modified products. 14% named viruses and infections, and only 11% out of 21% who have here the hybrid threats mentioned that those are the threats coming from Russia. So I believe this once again demonstrates that the lack of awareness and confusion about our today's topic. And as the different researches shows us, this is not only the Georgia's challenge. So my short opening question to both our speakers will be related to defining of the hybrid warfare concept. As the hybrid threats and hybrid warfare are probably one of the most commonly used concepts in the recent decades, even though there are no clearly defined and universally accepted boundaries. So before we move on to the discussion about the hybrid threats NATO and Georgia face, I would like to ask you about the changing character of the hybrid warfare and how you define this concept. So what we mean under the hybrid threats during our discussion. So I would like to start our discussion from Mr. Rasmus. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gogitá, and thank you for the invitation and having me here. I think it's a great starting question, actually, and it shows that there's still a lot of misunderstandings about the definitions. What do we mean by the concept of hybrid threats? And it's true that it's difficult to pin down because the concept is constantly changing. So that is actually why it's maybe not the most fruitful thing to try to list these threats. And perhaps a better way of looking at it would be to look at the ways in which they are manifested. First of all, there's an actor in the background with a motive and a method in a way. It could be a state actor, could be also non-state actor. Usually, hybrid refers to a combination of different means of influencing. Usually, the target is the vulnerabilities in our societies, the various borders and gaps in our structures and in our systems. And finally, usually the objective is to undermine our decision-making and reduce the area of maneuver that we might have. So it is essentially, it's a systemic challenge posed by autocracies and certain non-state actors.
Thank you so much. So we will be glad to hear from you as well, Mr. Nato.
Yes, well, thank you very much. First of all, it's great to see you after all the pandemic and no contacts live for this last 2 years. It's obviously very difficult to give a definition to something that has not been defined clearly so far. We live in a world where you are absolutely right saying that those challenges are changing constantly, and the definition, according to the definition of the hybrid threats, is changing as well. We see all sorts of varieties of the hybrid warfare, starting from mixed action by the Russian Federation. Let's say, let's take the Georgian case with the heavy military force standing on the occupied territories, and then on top of it, accompanied and strengthened by information warfare, psychological warfare, constant threats of the economic pressure and kicking out of the Russian markets of the Georgian products, all forms of soft power and sharp power being present in this very particular Georgia-Russia relationship, and continued with the things like China is doing this in today's world, when you have in most of the cases, not always, but in most of the cases, no military presence whatsoever, no guns shot at all, but at the same time, countries one after another losing their sovereignty, parts of their sovereignty, to the People's Republic of China, being it under the economic pressure, under the death threat, under the various forms of the financial dependency that is created by the loan and debt strategy of this country. So we can give the broadest definition as possible, being it basically weakening the state to the extent that it's part of its sovereignty, at least part, sometimes entirely, but at least part of its sovereignty falls under the influence of a given state. Again, you don't need to use the heavy machinery anymore. You don't need to roll tanks necessarily over the border. The definition of the borders is not that clear anymore either because of the cyberspace and all the activities there. And just by exercising certain forms of the hybrid warfare, you can achieve your goals. It's like in the classical definition of the war, that war is the political game with different kinds of instruments. So now those different kinds of instruments are becoming even more diverse and even more different than centuries ago.
Thank you so much. I think this will help us to better guide our discussions and have more clear understanding about the definition of the hybrid threats. So I would like to get back to Mr. Rasmus. So hybrid threat has an important role as a platform between NATO and the EU to support sharing the expertise, building the cross-governmental and cross-sectoral network. So how effective and how resilient the democratic international institutions such as NATO and the EU are to accordingly respond to modern hybrid threats? And what are the key vulnerabilities still remains on the agenda?
Well, thank you. And I think you described the role of our center very well. It's indeed a platform to support our participating states, the EU and NATO, and to foster the cooperation and exchange best practices. When it comes to these institutions, the EU and NATO, they have built and are building capabilities for responding to hybrid threats. But I mean, the starting point usually is that the primary responsibility for responding is with the member states. So that's usually how we start in thinking of these issues. But certainly there's an added value in having an international response. The vulnerabilities, there are vulnerabilities across different sectors. Ranging from cyber domain to space domain to supply chain dependencies, but I would perhaps highlight one thing when it comes to figuring out the proper responses, and that is the issue of coherence of the response, and that is a challenge for the EU specifically because it's such a broad. Comprehensive actor, so to get everybody in line and singing from the same sheet of music is a challenge in itself. In a way, it's a different type of challenge for NATO because it doesn't have the similar broader tools at its disposal. And finally, the coherence is a key challenge because that's exactly where the adversaries are trying to hit. They're trying to drive wedges in our societies and in the international institutions to undermine the unity and with that also the coherence of the responses.
Thank you so much. Let me just clarify that do you feel that we are moving on the right dimension? Do you feel that the institutions we create, the center of excellences we also support, and there are different centers of excellence, yeah, not only countering and hybrid threats. Do you have a feeling that we are moving on the right dimension and we are enhancing our resilience and our capabilities to be more effective in terms of countering the hybrid threats?
I certainly think that we are moving in the right direction. The tricky thing is, as was mentioned in the beginning, that it's a moving target. So it's about constantly reinventing ourselves and updating our systems and our responses. But it's going in the right direction. So it's a double challenge. We need to make sure that each sector is resilient and capable, whether we're looking at transport sector or energy sector or the information domain or even military domain. So making sure that each sector is resilient and capable enough, but then also trying to ensure that there's this overall coherence of our efforts. So bringing in the comprehensive approach to that. I think that's the double challenge.
Thank you so much. Next question is related more about the Georgian context. But as we say, for Georgia as well as Western states, the hybrid warfare is an increasing threat that hampers the sustainable development of the countries. And since 2008, after the Russia-Georgian war, Russia has been constantly leveraging hybrid warfare tools against Georgia in order to achieve political, military, social, economic, and other type of influences. So considering the complexity of the Russian hybrid warfare and the threats stemming from it, how do you assess the institutional readiness and the country's capacity to counter the hybrid threats? So I would have this question to Ms. Tináthin, please.
Unfortunately, that's exactly where the weakness or biggest weakness of the Georgian state is. And the problem that we live in today is, yes, it is obviously the partial occupation of a country. Of course, it is the clearly demonstrated actions of Russia against Georgia at different levels, at different institutions. But at the same time, and probably not less important, is that is the institutional weakness of Georgia as a state. The problem with our national security system, the problem of the the coherence that was mentioned in here, or absence of one, I would say, when, as we say here, when the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing in most of the cases, non-existing strategic communication and non-existing strategic approach to the problem, daily decision-making based on that particular day's importance rather than coming from the long-term plans and long-term vision for the solution of the problem will be major difficulties on the way of either the occupation of the country or creation of a resilient and strong state that is capable of addressing the hybrid threats that are increasingly dominating our everyday life. The problem for Georgia, yes, obviously the biggest number of the problems, biggest percentage of the problem is coming from the north, is coming from Russia. But at the same time, on a daily basis, we are witnessing lots of other challenges as well, and not necessarily coming only and exclusively from Russia. I don't know, unfriendly, undemocratic neighborhood will be one of those big problems that Georgia is facing on a daily basis. Living in a part of the world where, regardless of your shortcomings, you are still the front runner, obviously is a big challenge for Georgia, because we are now front runners if you take in democratic terms and if you compare it to democratic states. But if you live in a region as we do, then the standards are very, very low. The demands from you are very low. And it obviously creates even more weakness, and it encourages even more weakness of the institutions as they are today. So I would say that number one priority for us, as for Georgians, as the people who are involved in public life, should be strengthening the state institutions, strengthening the resilience, having some structured approach and strategic approach to building a strong, resilient, capable state of at least stopping the intervention on very easy marks for certain weeks and certain days before the partners will intervene and support us. Unfortunately, we are not even there. So I always ask this question, why Russia is not doing something even more actively today than they are doing, because we are so weak and we are so vulnerable to all these threats coming from the outside. And probably the answer is exactly in the definition of the hybrid warfare. They can achieve whatever results they want to achieve in Georgia without any particular strong, clear, tangible interference that you can broadcast on CNN or BBC and let the world know that it is happening in Georgia.
So in this regard, where do you think that Georgia had the biggest challenge? On political level, that you think that there's a lack of understanding of the complexity and of the hybrid threats, or during the implementation of the policy reforms and during the implementation of the actual policy priorities? Because one step is to have an understanding about these threats, and the second is to effectively respond on them. So which components do you highlight as the key challenge on Georgian reality?
I would say both. We do have problem, well, at least we have a feeling that we do have a problem with understanding of the complexity of the issue and problems. We saw it most vividly in 2018 when the new constitutional changes were adopted. The whole idea of the hybrid warfare was ignored, and Georgia took a road of a very conventional understanding of the war, when necessarily tanks are rolling, and that's the only case and only situation when country recognizes state of war. We do have problem with the policy solutions as well, because there are no policy solutions as written up and drawn. Again, to give an example, since 2018, it's been 3 years, we do not have a national security strategy. We do not have a national security concept, which is completely ununderstandable and unforgivable in a way, because of the situation we are in. Even under normal circumstances, it would be crazy, but living under the partial occupation, obviously, and not having a main strategic document according to which all institutional buildings should be fitted, all the policies should be written out, and all the ministries and governmental institutions should be acting, sounds pretty challenging and strange. And third, I would say the biggest problem for Georgian government today is that the entire decision-making process is tied up to a very simple narrative. What the Moscow will think about it. This is the main narrative that is driving Georgian government today. It's not that they are moving voluntarily towards Russia. It's not that they are voluntarily doing something that pleases Russia. No, the problem is that any decision that they are taking, or a decision they are thinking of taking, is guided by the answer to a question, what the Moscow's reaction will be. So when the state lives under this huge pressure of fear that we are in today, then it is completely difficult and completely impossible to talk about the sovereign state security policy of a given country.
Thank you so much. I really have a lot of questions about topics which you have mentioned, but I should have to move to Mr. Rasmus. Mr. Rasmus, you have mentioned the role of coherence and importance of it, and the hybrid cell is promoting need of whole of government and whole of society approach to counter hybrid threats. So could you please elaborate more about the role and importance of the mentioned approaches, and should we have to consider it as the best practice to more effectively counter the hybrid threats?
Yes, I think you could call it the best practice in a way, and obviously not all of the things work the same way in all societies. You need to consider structures and culture and so on, but it is a useful best practice. And for instance, some of the Nordic countries have a long history of operating with a comprehensive approach, so there might be some useful benchmarks there. So when we're talking about a comprehensive whole of society and whole of government approach, I think we can try to distinguish between a couple of key lines of effort, and the starting point should be a coherent, comprehensive strategy, and also some structures to make sure that the strategy can be followed up. But there are different layers. There's the resilience part, which was already discussed. So it's a matter of reducing dependencies, building an informed citizenry, so harnessing the strength of the individuals, but also including and engaging the private sector. And how to do it, it should be a good balanced combination of incentives and regulation. So that's resilience. And then there are responses, but maybe somewhere in between resilience and responses, we need to consider situational awareness, which is, again, has to be comprehensive. There should be a solid understanding of what's happening in each corner of the government, each corner of the society, and feeding that analysis and information into the decision-making processes. Sometimes in a very short period of time and with inadequate information. So sharing information is a critical part of this comprehensive approach. And then finally, the responses. If something happens, there would be a need to respond, but not necessarily responding in kind. So if something happens in a cyber domain, it doesn't necessarily mean that the response has to be in cyber domain. But the response should be based in a comprehensive approach, meaning that there should be a broad toolbox, as it were, where a proper tool could be picked. It doesn't have to be the same, but it should be a broad base from which we can draw upon to sort of allow us to manage escalation in a kind of effective and responsible way.
You mentioned the role of communications, and as we see during the implementation of NATO and EU policies, the strategic communications became more and more important, and it is gaining more and more attention. And we see the new institutions and the new strategies, which is directly focused on strategic communication. So that's why I would like to again focus on strategic communications and how proactive we can be, and how big role the strategic communications it has to counter the disinformation. Because as we see very often, we are one step behind as we are responding this disinformation and propaganda campaigns, and it's getting more and more challenging to create our own narrative and to creating our own agenda. So I would like to, in general, ask the role of the strategic communication.
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's a critical role, and as you said, there are basically two ways of looking at it. The first one is the real strategic communication, which is more proactive and strategic, and the other one tends to be more reactive. But essentially, both are needed. When it comes to our proactive communication, there are two main audiences. It's the internal audience. We need to be able to communicate effectively to our citizens so that they understand what's at stake and what it is that we are doing about it. But it's also about communicating externally to partners, to adversaries, and getting your narrative. But then there's the other aspect, which is the more reactive one, and that's countering disinformation attempts, and that's also a huge field and a huge effort to counter that, and that needs to build on a number of different tools, starting from countering false narratives, debunking myths, but also making sure that our citizens are media savvy, digitally, with digital skills, and making sure that the base structure, freedom of media, it still exists, and making sure that some of the less regulated platforms, including some of the social media platforms, also follow certain rules and certain regulations, looking at how data is being collated and how it's being exploited, all of these different types of issues come together in our efforts in countering disinformation.
Thank you so much. So I believe one of the important takeaways for Mr. Rasmus' opinion, which he mentioned, is that even Georgia cannot counter the hybrid threats alone. So, and this has been once again demonstrated during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the country has faced well-organized disinformation campaigns and even the cyber attacks. So coordination with the partners is essential and has a key role to be more effective and to build resilience. And I would like to ask Ms. Tinathin, so how do you assess Georgia's cooperation and partnership with the NATO and with the EU in terms of countering the hybrid threat? So what are the key tools and instruments for Georgia to ensure more integration in the Western security systems and building the country's resilience? Because without it, as we see, it will be extremely challenging to be more successful and to be more resilient in terms of such huge risks.
Well, absolutely. There is no country, I guess it's not just Georgia, but any country who can operate in this changed world alone. You need partners, you need partnerships, you need common strategies in order to fight the threats and challenges that exist out there. I believe that Georgia, NATO, Georgia and European Union cooperation is much more progressive and delivers more results than the domestic Georgian agenda. There are very important and several tools in this relationship. I'm not a big expert on the European Union, Georgia-EU cooperation, but when it comes to NATO, since 2014, and then after the Warsaw Summit in 2016, we have developed lots of, on the one hand, common strategies, lots of common policy documents and policy directives, as well as lots of instruments helping, on the one hand, Georgia military forces and Georgia Ministry of Defense, and the entire security sector, I would say. And on the other hand, Georgia as a state, altogether to fight various forms of hybrid warfare against us. When it comes to propaganda, information, disinformation activities, particularly, we have particularly lots of instruments on that. How much they are used, and in practical terms, how much they are helping the country to be resilient and resistant to those threats is a different story. But when it comes to the written out policy papers with the European Union or NATO, or the instruments or the support from our partners, the expertise that we are getting constantly from our partners, it is all there. We had excellent experts working for the MOD sent by the Finnish government, for example. We have lots of support from the Latvian Center of Excellence, again, in this fight against the propaganda. We have excellent support and great expertise coming from Estonia when it comes to fighting the threats in cyberspace, and so on and so forth. Every single of, well, actually, according to Georgia NATO document, every single of 17 segments that we have identified as the main challenges and threats to Georgia in this big hybrid warfare have been supported and aligned actually to concrete NATO member states and actively promoted by them to have a strong standing in the country. But once again, in order to have all those instruments actually working and serving its purpose, we need to have, and you spoke about the strategic communication, you need to have a strategy to communicate, right? You need to have a long-term vision for the, well, maybe not solution, but at least for something close to solution, and then to decide how to communicate it, being it internally or internationally with your partners or non-partners. The biggest problem for Georgia, probably in this field, in this concrete direction when it comes to the information warfare, disinformation activities, the psychological operations. That will be very blurred line between the very blurred line in understanding who are the enemies and who are the partners of this country, who are what is wrong and what is right for this country. You mentioned COVID-19, and there we saw it perfectly clear how bad things can go and how wrong things go. And the current numbers that we have, for example, for the vaccination, very low numbers are the best indication how well those, I call them forces of darkness, are working in a society, and how big is the influence that they have over the society here.
And thank you so much. These topics are really very, very important for Georgia, as we are the front line of this countering disinformation, propaganda, and in general hybrid threats. So that's why I think the institutional development and having the long-term vision and having the strategies is the key, really, to build up more resilient states. So the key role to counter the hybrid threats still has the NATO, and launching the NATO 2030 agenda, which should be followed by a renewed strategic concept by next year, sounds really promising. And I would have a next question to both of the speakers. So how do you think the NATO is going to shape its policy against the hybrid threat? So do you see the novelty and innovative ways? Because as we see, we need to take some more proactive steps and be more innovative. So that would be very important to hear your vision. How do you assess the current policy priorities of the NATO in this regard? And also, can we expect that the Article 5 will be spread over the hybrid war, or do you think that it will be a subject of interpretation which gives the member countries freedom to undertake a real response only if they desire to? Because this is also has been under discussion quite often, and it would be really important to hear your thoughts about that. So, Mr. Rasmus, please.
Yeah, thank you. NATO has been doing quite good work on countering hybrid threats for several years now. And this is not easy, because we're basically talking about adjusting our thinking and adjusting our concepts, and the fact that the old models don't necessarily apply. And having this kind of adjustment is, of course, a challenge for individual countries as much as it is to institutions. It's a change of culture of working as well. But the NATO 2030 process was a good example of a kind of a forward-leaning effort, and let's see to what extent it will be reflected in the strategic concept. Another good example of evolution is the way cyber threats are now considered in the context of Article 5 and how they could trigger it. But when it comes to, you mentioned the interpretation of Article 5, I mean, obviously, there most likely won't be any clearly defined thresholds for all types of different hybrid attacks. And that's actually fine, because there needs to be a level of strategic ambiguity. But internally, there's still a process of reflection to be had about the nature of the threats and what kind of thresholds they might cross. In a general sense, there's a limit to what kind of tools could be used by NATO if we're talking about below the threshold of Article 5. But I think the work on, for instance, on resilience, which is also in the context of Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, is a good example of the way these issues are being tackled and how the resilience is being built. And finally, maybe would draw attention to NATO-EU cooperation, which always has been crucial, but it's becoming more and more crucial, because there's the overlap of memberships, but there's a certain overlap of the agendas as well. And just because of the fact that the EU has a broad set of tools at its disposal, so there really should be more synergies to be explored in that cooperation.
Thank you so much. But in general, would you assess that this is an ambitious plan from NATO to counter the hybrid threat? So how would be your general evaluation of the actual steps which is planned from the NATO side during the 2030 perspective?
Well, yes, I mean, the 2030 perspective was ambitious, and as I said, it remains to be seen to what extent it will be then implemented after the strategic concept. But I think the key areas to focus on are let's say the newer domains, cyber domain and space domain, and the role of the emerging and disruptive technologies, and how all of this should be looked at in the context of cooperation between NATO and the EU. I think those are some of the key points.
And what can be the role of the neighboring countries of the NATO and EU? I mean, for example, the Eastern Partnership countries, and the countries who openly declare that, for example, Ukraine, Georgia, who would like to join the NATO and who would like to be a member of the European Union. So do you think that we need more building resilience and more concrete tools to make sure that those countries who are on the front line fighting against the Russian hybrid threats, that there is an additional need to make sure that these countries have more resilient institutions in this regard?
Yeah, I think there's a need for close cooperation, both in the sense of having a joint situational awareness of what's happening, what types of threats are emerging in which areas, and to get those examples out to share the best practices, but also cooperation in building capabilities and building resilience. And I think it's also a matter, at this point at least, it's also a matter of raising awareness of these issues also among general public. So there's a role for certain training and also I think exercising is important, because these are mostly new types of threats that we are seeing, and the combination of those threats, so they also need to be exercised in a novel ways.
Thank you so much. Mr. Nathan, please, could you like me to repeat the question or not?
Well, I would say that for our particular interest, well, obviously this document is very important. It's important for many reasons, including the fact that it is always good to have a long-term vision and to see what are the main directions or key directions that our partner countries or institutions are taking. And in this case, the NATO 2030 is a critically important document for us. For Georgian purposes, I would say that proposal number 5 will be or will work as the key to our partnership and to our interest. It's called Uphold the Rules-Based International Order. And as long as NATO is serious about upholding rules-based international order, we can expect much more security and much more deterrence policies shown from the NATO side against those who are violating that rules-based international order. So you keep it not for Georgia or for Ukraine or for Estonia, but you keep it for those who are violating it constantly, right? So as long as NATO stays tough and critical and strong on the values that this organization was built on, and on the particular directions that are written in this document, I think we can feel very comfortable in continuous, on the one hand, and even stronger cooperation with them. Obviously, for Georgia, there is no alternative to more membership, but at the same time, we understand that just Georgians talking about the membership is not going to bring membership to us. So we need to be open to all different ideas when it comes to the segment sectors, the dimensions where NATO and member states are interested in and somehow fit our interest in. So I see lots of the different positions in this document as important for us, but as mentioned already, this proposal number 5 looks one of the most relevant and most important for Georgia's purposes. As for the Article 5, I would share Mr. Rasmus's opinion about it. It took so long for NATO to finally recognize that cyber war was the same type of a war as any other that we know historically, that I don't expect NATO being clear and definite about different forms of hybrid threats in a near future. But again, the biggest friend in that for us is Mr. Vladimir Putin, because as brutal he is, and as much as he continues on the way he chose years back, maybe all our partner institutions will become not only more resilient themselves, but also more understanding of the problems of others, particularly aspirant countries like Georgia and Ukraine, who've been promised membership once upon a time.
Yeah, as we see, that is somehow maybe the medium-long perspective to be a member of the European family. You spoke about the European perspective and you spoke about the membership of the NATO, but on the point of very practical point of view, do you see the additional practical instruments that Georgia, maybe bilaterally, not only I'm talking about the having a partnership with the EU and NATO, but on bilateral point of view, working more with the member countries. So do you see it as a solution to make sure for building our resilience?
Yeah, I would say that there are two particular instruments that will be that should be top priority for Georgia to fight for before membership to NATO. One being Black Sea security, which is already out there since the Warsaw Summit, and we can get as much benefit as we fight for in it. Unfortunately, there is not that much of an activity going on right now, but I hope that that Georgia will become more actively engaged on the one hand in already existing Black Sea security mechanisms, that at the same time will start using the benefit of the declared goals in Warsaw Summit communique for strengthening even more our position on that. And the second, on a more bilateral level, will be fighting for the defense pact with the United States of America, again, before the membership to NATO, because it might, as the practice shows and as the practice proves with non-NATO member countries, that is one of those solutions where you can have more resilience and you can actually enjoy a higher level of security from the external threats coming to your country. Those two will be, if they need to be defined, my top priorities. Becoming more active, using all the instruments, using the language of the Warsaw Communique for strengthening Black Sea security, Georgia's positioning in Black Sea security. There is still window of opportunity left in there for making Georgia ports a part of the system and key points in the system. And on the other hand, to work with the United States bilaterally to get to the defense pact, which will help Georgia to survive under the circumstances we are right now.
Thank you so much. I guess we have shared many very interesting ideas. I have received two very good questions from our audience. One is directly to Mr. Rasmus, and the other question is to both of the speakers. So I will start with Mr. Rasmus. Sofia Lejava has a question to Mr. Rasmus. You have experience of working at the Ministry of Defense of Finland. Please tell us what is the key lessons learned for the Finland on countering the hybrid threats?
Yes, I think this goes a little bit back to what I said about the best practices, and one of them being the application of a comprehensive security model. So we have in Finland had this comprehensive security model for a long time, and it's really a base for our preparedness and resilience. meaning that it encompasses all the different sectors of the government, making sure that each sector is ready and that they are ready to act together when something happens. But on the other hand, it's about engaging the private sector, because especially a lot of the critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. A lot of our stockpiles, supply chains, they are the realm of private sector. So a constant engagement and procedures with the private sector. And finally, engaging the individuals, the citizens, making sure that the education system is such that they are well informed about the threats that we might be facing now or in the future, to make sure that they are media literate and digitally skilled and so on. I think those are important. They're not just the Ministry of Defense perspective, of course, but the broader societal perspective.
I had an opportunity to visit Finland and introduce its strategic communication system, and where I have seen the actual whole of society approach, that was, I guess, the best example how the Finland's government works and how they communicate with different stakeholders, with media, with the civil society organizations, and how high the public trust is towards the state institutions. So I believe the public trust and credibility also has a huge importance to build the resilience of the institution. So that was really impressive, and I believe the Finland's experience is one of the best in the world, not only in the EU, I guess. Thank you so much. And the next question is from Gogita. To what extent can we conceptualize the hybrid warfare within the context of ongoing global competition between the authoritarians and the Western side of liberal democracy? This is, I believe, a very interesting question, and I would like to ask Ms. Tináthin to response on that. Thank you.
Well, it's a question for the entirely different conference. The whole conference, actually, it is so big and so wide. But to be very brief, in just one sentence, this is exactly how this world is divided between those who are creating or inventing different types of hybrid threats on a daily basis, and on the other hand, the democracies, liberal democracies, trying to escape the various traps put by those authoritarian regimes all around the world, not only and not necessarily directly in their own countries, but in the countries fighting for democracy and fighting for freedom. The main issue will be supporting, protecting, helping those states on the front lines who are sort of tangible examples of the fact whether the fight for liberal democracy will work or not, or whether it will fail, whether the international community will be strong enough to support those countries against the growing authoritarianism or growing attacks from the authoritarian states or not. That's actually where the whole line is drawn between democracies and non-democracies. Ones are creating the problems, the others are trying to create resilient and strong communities to stand strong under these new circumstances.
Thank you. Mr. Rasmus?
Yeah, I would very much echo what Ms. Tináthin said, and maybe taking the two terms there, first talking about the sort of great power competition and the strategic competition, which has brought a level of instability in the global power relations. And that instability gives more space for malign actors to start trying their influencing, and it's a relatively low risk and low cost influencing. So they are too free to do that at the moment. And it's indeed a systemic struggle. So it's an attempt to compromise our democratic values and systems and decision-making systems. But then to focus on the competition and the fact that we are in an age of constant competition, and that says something about the nature of the threats. Competition refers to a type of threat environment where the threats are mostly below the threshold. So again, it doesn't necessarily lead to conventional conflicts. It could, of course, lead to that. But the fact is that we are on a daily basis facing these types of competition and these types of attacks and influencing attempts against our structures. So in that sense, I think that the nature of the global system and threat environment explains where we are and why we should be countering hybrid threats more forcefully.
Thanks a lot. I would like to say a very special thanks to our excellent speakers, and I believe that the discussion was extremely useful, and we have had an opportunity to hear many very interesting ideas and even solutions how to be more resilient against the hybrid threats. And it's always a pleasure to talk to and to listen to you. And based on our discussion, I guess we all agree that the speed and the scale and the intensity of the hybrid threats have increased in recent years. And in order to more effectively respond to the hybrid threats, we need to maybe look beyond the established practices and formats and be more innovative in this regard. So being prepared to prevent, counter, or respond to the hybrid attacks whenever by state or non-state actors already should be one of the top priority of any country, I guess, to ensure more sustainable development of our society. So GCSD's next talk will be held on 15th of December, and it will be focused on NATO and Russia relations. Once again, I would like to thank our guests and say a special thank to our audience who was with us today and shared very interesting questions with us. I wish you all the safe and I wish you all to be sound. So if you have any final remarks, this is the right moment. If not, I would like to say once again, very big thank you to you all for being with us today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gogita.
Thank you so much.